In 1914, almost every country in Europe was ruled by a king, a Kaiser, a Tsar, or an emperor. Within 4 decades, most of those thrones were gone, shot, exiled, voted out, or simply erased from the map. 3 of the biggest belonged to men who were cousins, who wrote each other letters, who wore each other's uniforms at each other's parades. Only one of those 3 families still sits on a throne today. When people picture the collapse of Europe's royal world, they picture Russia, they picture the Romanovs, Nicholas II, the last Tsar, ruler of 1/6 of the Earth's surface, a man who genuinely believed God had personally handed him absolute authority over 170 million people. His reign was enormous. It was ceremonial. It was glittering beyond anything Britain could match, and it ended in a cellar in Ekaterinburg in July of 1918 with his wife, his 4 daughters, his 13-year-old son, the family doctor, and 3 servants. Nicholas had a first cousin, same grandparents on his mother's side, faces so similar that people who met them both said they could have been twins. That cousin was George V of the United Kingdom. And in the same years that Nicholas lost everything, the crown, the country, the family, the life, George kept all of it, not by fighting harder, not by having a better army. He kept it by doing something that looked at the time like weakness. Here's what most people don't realize about the British monarchy. It did not survive because it was stronger than the others. It survived because, centuries earlier, it had already lost. It had already been beaten, humiliated, abolished, and put back together with most of its teeth removed. By 1917, when the thrones of Europe started falling like dominoes, there was almost nothing left of British royal power worth overthrowing. And that, more than anything else, is why it's still standing. But that only explains part of it. Because plenty of monarchies were constitutional by 1914, and plenty of them still fell. Something else was going on. Something the Windsors have never advertised, and one decision in particular that a British king made in 1917, a decision involving his own cousin, that historians didn't fully understand until 60 years after everyone involved was dead. Let's start where the difference begins. Not in 1917. In 1649, on a freezing January morning that year, in front of the banqueting house in Whitehall, a king of England was walked onto a public scaffold and beheaded in front of a crowd of his own subjects. Charles I, not assassinated in a corridor, not quietly poisoned, not exiled, executed after a trial, by the order of a court, in daylight in the middle of London. England then abolished the monarchy entirely and ran itself as a republic for 11 years under Oliver Cromwell. Think about what that did to the institution's memory. Every British monarch who came after 1649 grew up knowing something that no Tsar, no Kaiser, no Habsburg emperor ever really absorbed in his bones. This country has killed a king before, and it can do it again. The lesson wasn't abstract. It was a family story, and the country learned something too. It learned that a republic was possible, and, for a lot of people, that the experiment had been miserable. The Cromwellian regime was austere, military, and unpopular by the end. When Charles II was restored in 1660, the restoration wasn't a royalist triumph so much as an exhausted compromise. Britain had tried life without a crown and hadn't enjoyed it. That single fact would matter enormously 250 years later, because it meant the British public's revolutionary energy had already been spent and had already disappointed them. Then came 1688. James II, Charles II's brother, pushed too hard, and Parliament simply invited a foreign prince, William of Orange, to come and take the throne instead. James fled. There was barely any fighting in England, and out of it came the Bill of Rights of 1689, which put in writing what the monarchy could no longer do. No taxing without Parliament. No keeping a standing army in peacetime without Parliament. No suspending laws. No interfering with elections. Read that list again, because it's the whole story in miniature. Every single power stripped from the British crown in 1689 was a power that the Tsar, the Kaiser, and the Austrian Emperor still personally held in 1914, 225 years later. Then 1701, the Act of Settlement, where Parliament didn't just limit the monarch's powers, it chose the next dynasty by statute. Parliament decided who would be king. Let that land. The line of succession itself became a piece of legislation, something the elected body wrote down and could, in principle, write differently. And then came an accident of history that finished the job. In 1714, the crown passed to George I of Hanover, a German prince whose English was poor and whose interests were largely still in Hanover. He didn't attend cabinet meetings the way his predecessors had. Power drained sideways into the hands of the ministers who did, and by 1721, one of them, Robert Walpole, was doing a job that would eventually be called Prime Minister. Nobody designed this. It happened because a king couldn't be bothered, and the country ran perfectly well without him. That's the thing about the British system that almost nobody outside Britain understood at the time. It wasn't built, it leaked into existence. Every crisis knocked another power loose from the crown, and instead of fighting to get it back, the monarchy learned to trade it away for something else, permanence. Which brings us to the 19th century, and to the woman who nearly threw it all away. Victoria came to the throne in 1837 at 18 years old. For the first 2 decades of her reign, she and her husband Albert made the monarchy into something new, respectable, domestic, middle class in its values, a model family on a throne rather than a court of aristocratic scandal. It was genuinely popular. And then Albert died in December 1861, and Victoria essentially vanished. She went into a mourning that lasted years. She stopped appearing in public. She avoided the ceremonial duties that justified her existence in most people's eyes. And the British public, who were paying for a monarchy they never saw, started asking a question that had been dormant for 2 centuries. What exactly is this for? By the early 1870s, there were Republican clubs forming across British cities. In November 1871, the MP Charles Dilke stood up in Newcastle and made a public case against the cost and the point of the monarchy, and he was not shouted down. Pamphlets circulated calculating what the royal family cost the taxpayer. This is the part of the story that gets skipped. In the decade when Britain was at the height of its imperial power, its monarchy was closer to being argued out of existence than at almost any point since Cromwell. What saved it was, of all things, typhoid. Victoria's son Bertie, the Prince of Wales, caught the disease that had killed his father and nearly died in the winter of 1871. The country followed it day by day. When he recovered, there was a public Thanksgiving service at St. Paul's in February 1872, and enormous crowds turned out, and the mood simply broke. The Republican moment passed almost overnight. Now here's what mattered. The monarchy took the warning seriously. It changed its behavior. Victoria was pushed back into public view. The institution began deliberately building itself around visibility, Jubilee, ceremony, and empire, the Golden Jubilee of 1887. The Diamond Jubilee of 1897, spectacles designed to make the crown feel like the emotional center of a global empire rather than an expensive old lady in Scotland. And in 1867, in the middle of all this, a journalist named Walter Bagehot wrote the book that explained what was actually happening. He described the British Constitution as having 2 halves. The dignified part, which impresses the public and commands loyalty, and the efficient part, which actually governs. The monarchy, he argued, had become the first. Ministers were the second. As for what a monarch still had left, Bagehot summarized it as the right to be consulted, to encourage, and to warn. 3 verbs. That was the job description of the most famous throne on earth. To a Russian courtier, that would have read as humiliation. It was survival insurance, and within 50 years it would pay out. So now we arrive at 1914 and at the 3 cousins, Nicholas II of Russia, Wilhelm II of Germany, George V of Britain. George was a first cousin to both of them, to Nicholas through their mothers, who were Danish sisters, and to Wilhelm through Wilhelm's mother, who was the eldest daughter of Queen Victoria. 3 men, related by blood, wearing the honorary uniforms of each other's armed forces, signing letters to each other with childhood nicknames, and running 3 states that were about to go to war and destroy 2 of them. But look at what each of them actually was. Nicholas was an autocrat by law and by conviction. He had reluctantly permitted a parliament, the Duma, after the 1905 revolution, and he spent the following decade undermining it. Wilhelm commanded the German army directly, appointed his chancellor without needing the Reichstag's approval, and treated foreign policy as a personal hobby, with results that horrified his own diplomats. George V, by contrast, could do almost nothing without a minister's signature. He could not declare war on his own initiative in any practical sense. He could not appoint a government the Commons would not accept. He was, by the standards of his cousins, a constitutional ornament. And when the war went badly, this is the crucial point, the ornament had nothing to be blamed for. That's the mechanism. In Russia, the Tsar personally took command of the army in 1915. He literally put his own name on every defeat that followed. Every dead conscript, every bread queue in Petrograd, every catastrophic offensive had one identifiable owner. When the system broke in March 1917, there was no separating the monarchy from the failure, because the monarchy had insisted on being the failure's author. In Britain, the war was run by Asquith and then Lloyd George, by generals and by cabinets. When the Somme went wrong, when the ships were sunk, when the casualty lists filled the newspapers, the rage had somewhere to go that wasn't the palace. Governments could fall and be replaced, and the throne stayed exactly where it was, untouched, because it had already given away the power that would have made it a target. Losing power was the strategy. Nobody planned it that way, but that's what it turned out to be. Still, giving up power wasn't quite enough on its own, because by 1917 the British monarchy had a different problem, and it was one of blood. The royal house's family name was Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, German. Prince Albert had been German. The king's own cousin was the Kaiser. British royals held German titles and German princely ranks. And Britain in 1917 was a country where German shops had been attacked in the street, where dachshunds were kicked, where anyone with a German-sounding surname was suspect, and where the newspapers were in a permanent state of fury. On July 1717, George V simply abolished the problem by decree. The royal house would be known as the House of Windsor. Windsor, a castle, a town on the Thames, about as English a word as exists. All German titles held by the British branch of the family were relinquished. The Battenbergs became the Mountbattens. The Tecks became Cambridges. In a single announcement, the most German dynasty in Britain rebranded itself as the most English thing imaginable. It was cosmetic. It changed nothing about who these people were or where their grandparents came from. And it worked completely. That is the Windsor method in one gesture. Read the mood of the country and change the surface before anybody has to argue about the substance. But there's a harder decision from that same year, and this is the one that only came into full public view decades later. In March 1917, Nicholas II abdicated. The Russian provisional government now had a former czar and his family on its hands and wanted them somewhere else. The obvious destination was Britain. Nicholas was the British king's first cousin and personal friend. The British government, with Lloyd George as prime minister, agreed in principle to offer asylum. And then the offer quietly went away. The pressure to withdraw it came from the palace. George V's private secretary, Lord Stamfordham, wrote to the foreign secretary raising the danger that the arrival of the autocratic Tsar and his unpopular German-born wife would inflame British opinion at a moment when Britain itself had strikes, war exhaustion, and a visible Republican left. The king's household pressed the point repeatedly. The invitation was allowed to lapse. Other options were explored, none in time. 16 months later, the family was dead. For most of the 20th century, the story was that the British government had failed to act, and the royal family had been the victim of politicians. It was the historian Kenneth Rose, working with Royal Archives for a biography published in 1983, who laid out how much of the pressure had actually come from George V himself. Now think about what that tells you. Faced with a choice between his cousin's life and the security of his own throne, the king chose the throne, not out of cruelty. By every account, he was tormented by the news of the murders, but because he had absorbed from 300 years of family history the one lesson that the Romanovs never learned. Dynasties are not people. They outlive people, and they can be lost. That's the cold center of the British survival story, and it's why it isn't a fairy tale. Because at the same time, George was doing the other thing, the visible thing. Hundreds of visits to the front, to hospitals, to munitions factories, to shipyards. He gave up alcohol for the duration of the war after being asked to set an example at real personal cost to his popularity in some circles. He created the Order of the British Empire in 1917, an honor deliberately designed to be given to ordinary people, nurses, factory workers, volunteers, rather than only to aristocrats and generals. It was the first honor in British history built for civilians at that scale. Every one of those moves was the same instinct. Attach the crown to service, to duty, to the war effort, to the population. Detach it from politics, from decisions, from blame. Be everywhere and be responsible for nothing. Then look at what happened to the cousins. Wilhelm II abdicated in November 1918 and fled across the border into the Netherlands, where he spent 23 years chopping wood at a country house in Doorn, waiting for a restoration that never came, and died in 1941 with German troops guarding the gate. In Austria-Hungary, the Emperor Karl, who had been on the throne for barely 2 years, renounced participation in the affairs of state in November 1918, was pushed into exile, attempted 2 failed returns to Hungary in 1921, and died on the island of Madeira in 1922. He was 34 years old. The Habsburgs had ruled for 600 years, and it ended in a rented house with an unpaid heating bill. And it kept going. The Ottoman Sultanate was abolished in 1922, the last sultan slipping out of Istanbul on a British warship. The Caliphate followed in 1924, and the whole dynasty was expelled from Turkey. Bulgaria's monarchy was voted away in 1946 with a 9-year-old on the throne. Romania's king was forced to abdicate at gunpoint at the end of 1947. Italy's monarchy, which had endorsed Mussolini and then dumped him, went to a referendum in June 1946 and lost. Umberto II reigned for 34 days and left for Portugal. Greece lost its monarchy, got it back, lost it again, and abolished it by referendum in 1974. Spain's king left in 1931, and it took 44 years in a dictatorship before the crown came back. Set them all side by side, and a pattern jumps out that has nothing to do with popularity or personality. Almost every European monarchy that died as the direct consequence of a catastrophic military defeat or an occupation. Russia, Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottomans, Bulgaria, Italy, Romania, Greece. The throne went down with the state. Britain didn't lose. That's not a moral achievement of the monarchy. It's geography, industry, alliances, and the channel. But it's honest, and any explanation that skips it is selling something. The British crown was never handed the one event that reliably kills a dynasty. Total defeat on home soil with the monarch's name attached. What Britain did have, though, was every other stress test, and it passed them by using the same move over and over. Test 1, the empire. Between the 1920s and the 1960s, the largest empire in history came apart. That should have destroyed an institution whose entire modern identity had been built on imperial spectacle since Victoria. Instead, the crown was quietly redefined. The Balfour Declaration of 1926 and the Statute of Westminster in 1931 recast the dominions as equal, self-governing nations bound by shared allegiance to the crown rather than rule from London. The empire dissolved into a commonwealth, and the monarchy transformed from ruler to symbol of association. Same institution. Completely different justification. Test 2, media. In 1932, George V read a Christmas message on the radio, written for him by Rudyard Kipling, and millions of households heard a king's voice in their kitchens for the first time in history. Every previous generation of monarchy had guarded its distance. This one decided that the new technology was a friend, not a threat, and got in early. 21 years later, in 1953, the coronation of Elizabeth II was televised over the objections of the Prime Minister and much of the establishment, and it put an estimated 20 million people in front of screens in Britain alone, many of them watching television for the very first time. The monarchy didn't just survive the arrival of mass media, it used each wave to renew itself. Test 3, and the sharpest one. What happens when the monarch himself is the problem? In 1936, Edward VIII inherited the throne and, within months, made clear he intended to marry Wallis Simpson, an American with 2 living former husbands. The government said no. The church said no. The Dominion said no. And the system did something that no autocracy could have done. It removed the king and kept the kingship. Edward abdicated in December 1936. His younger brother became George VI, and the institution carried on without a single constitutional wound. That's the whole difference in one event. In an absolute monarchy, the man and the office are the same thing, so a crisis in the man is a crisis in the state. In the British system by 1936, the man was replaceable and the office wasn't. The Romanovs could never have done that. There was no mechanism, no precedent, and no willingness to admit that the person on the throne was not the point. Then the Second World War gave the new king the chance to complete the argument. George VI and Queen Elizabeth stayed in London through the Blitz, when they could easily have gone to Canada. Buckingham Palace was hit by German bombs in September 1940, and the Queen's reported response that she could now look the East End in the face is remembered 80 years later because it landed exactly right. Shared risk, same city, same danger, no special exit. Was it partly stagecraft? Of course it was. It was also true. They stayed, and the monarchy came out of the war more secure than it had been at any point in the previous century, at the exact moment when the Italian and Bulgarian and Romanian thrones were being swept away by the same war. Elizabeth II then did the thing that is hardest to see because it happened so slowly. 70 years of not making news, 7 decades of never publicly stating an opinion on a piece of legislation, never endorsing a party, never picking a fight she could lose. 15 prime ministers came and went, governments rose and collapsed, and the crown said nothing, which meant that nobody could ever aim at it. That doesn't mean it was easy. In 1992, after a year of family scandals and a fire at Windsor Castle, she publicly described it as a horrible year, and the mood in the country turned hard against royal finances, so the following year she began paying income tax. In 1997, after the death of Diana, the palace badly misread the public mood. The flag over Buckingham Palace became a national argument, and within days the Queen returned to London, walked among the crowds, and spoke live on television. Both times, criticism arrived, and both times the institution moved rather than dug in. which is exactly what it did in 1872, and in 1917, and in 1926, and in 1936. It's the same reflex every single time. Never argue with the country. Adjust and stay. So, why did Britain's monarchy survive when most of Europe's didn't? Not because it was loved more. The Romanovs were worshipped by millions of Russian peasants who believed the Tsar was ordained by God. Adoration is not protection, not because it was more powerful. Being powerful is precisely what killed the others. Power means ownership, ownership means blame, and blame in a catastrophe means the end. It survived because it lost its wars against its own people early, in the 1640s and the 1680s, and made its peace with the result. It survived because by the time the 20th century arrived with its revolutions, there was almost nothing left to seize, no autocracy to overthrow, no personal rule to dismantle, just a family performing continuity, while elected politicians did the governing and absorbed the hatred. It survived because it changed its name, its image, its purpose, and its finances whenever the pressure demanded, and never once tried to win the argument by force. And yes, it survived because Britain was never invaded, never occupied, and never lost the war that would have made the crown answerable for it. There's one more thing, and it's the uncomfortable one. It survived because in 1917 a king weighed his cousin's life against his own family's future and chose the future, and then spent the rest of his reign making sure nobody had a reason to come for him. Wilhelm ended up chopping wood in Holland. Karl died at 34 in exile on an Atlantic island. Nicholas died in a cellar with his children. George V died in his bed at Sandringham in January 1936, King of the United Kingdom and Emperor of India, with his dynasty intact and his heirs in place. Same generation, same family tree, same century, completely different endings, and the difference wasn't luck or God or the affection of the crowd. It was 300 years of an institution learning over and over that survival is what you get in exchange for giving things up. The question the House of Windsor faces now is whether that trade still has anything left to offer. Charles III came to the throne in September 2022, after the longest reign in British history, into a country where support for the monarchy among younger people is measurably weaker than among their grandparents, where several Commonwealth realms are openly discussing becoming republics, and where the argument about cost and purpose that Charles Dilke made in Newcastle in 1871 is being made again in almost identical words. The Windsors have answered that question before. They answered it by rebranding, by broadcasting, by paying tax, by walking into the crowd. Every time the country asked what the monarchy was for, the monarchy invented a new answer fast enough to keep the question from settling. Whether it can do that one more time is the only part of this story that isn't history yet.